All right, welcome. Let's see here. Hi, Rena, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good.
You
Hi,
got
guys.
hello, guys. You're chugging along here. We're getting up to the causes of the Civil War, and hi, Jessica. Let's see here. We're so that in of itself shows us that we're getting toward the finish line with this semester. Right now, I've been playing uh, catch up with about 7 different assignments from 2 different classes, but unfortunately, it's not your school, and it's only not out of favoritism, but out of triage, because they're done a month before you guys are. So I apologize for that. It's another setback of being instructed by an adjunct who's at numerous schools. But I hope you guys are doing okay. Haven't forgotten about your assignments, and want to make sure that we're on the same page on this next topic. Okay, so let's see here. As I'm painfully trying to multitask, let me first ask: are there any comments or questions, or anything with which I need to be aware? All right. Well, I'll interpret that silence as a good one. That all is well. I finally did catch up on your Canvas messages. Uh, so let's see here. At least last night I did. Um, the Civil War, right? Every time a subject is broached by historians, they try to put data together, right, um, to form a narrative. And it especially gets tricky or messy or contested, right, when it comes to um, causation, right? Because that's kind of a subjective thing. I mean, can we really definitively state, okay, this and these variables, these factors definitively caused the Civil War to happen from 1861 to 1865? That's a bold claim, right? Because you worry about, okay, you could be easily guilty of correlation without causation, right? Uh, Two athletes are playing a sport. What really contributed to one athlete defeating the other? Was it work ethic? Was it just natural skill? Was it experience? Was it what they were wearing? And one was wearing something much more comfortable. Was one better off in the environment with the given weather than the other? Something with the other one's, whatever. And so equipment, it's really a messy deal trying to deal with causation, right? But it also makes it enjoyable, right? Because you get to have good, healthy dialogue about, whatever the topic may be in history. So with this is no different. What caused the Civil War? But number one, however, right, is I kind of stick to the old school court history narrative that we received when we were young, right, as young kids, etc. And remember, court history praises those who politically, socially, and economically won. It makes heroes of them. Whatever institutions, laws, right, practices that they kind of, implement, we're proud of and we defend, right? Remember, a part of American court history entails American exceptionalism, that we are a special country, right? We're, and of course, in a good way, right? Was someone going to say something? Right.
Sorry for this, Jose. I was trying to figure out how to use Zoom on this.
Oh shoot! Can anyone help Jose? Man, Jose, I have my wife help me with everything, and literally set these up. I mean, what exactly do you need help with, Jose? Because it's wonderful that I was able to write down your name and I can hear you.
I figured it out now. It's because it's a different kind of phone, so I wasn't used to using Zoom with this, and I guess it works differently than the typical Android ones.
Aha.
I figured it out. Thanks.
Oh, good. Well, glad to have you, Jose. That's great. But by all means, you guys, if anybody has a comment or question or something that could enhance the class with any kind of information, please just feel free. I mean, seriously, to just go ahead and interrupt and cut in, and I'm fine with that. All right. And so until then, kind of moving on. So with court history, right? Oftentimes you have the notion of American exceptionalism, that we're a special country, right? Different from others in a superior way. And that entails oftentimes at least a couple things. One is that we're supposedly unusually a land of opportunity for more people, right? That equality of opportunity kind of highlights and symbolizes what we stand for. And then secondly, right, is that we are an idealistic country, right? And I keep it simple in my own mind. I'm not being condescending to you and dumbing down my own definition. This is my own definition. Is to me, idealism is you have a set ideology or worldview. You have a set notion of what's wrong with the world, what would make the world better, how you should go about doing that to make it better, and that you want to strictly adhere to that ideology or worldview to make sure that it's carried out. Because in the end, you're wanting to improve the world and you're wanting to mitigate or do away with what you perceive to be the major problems that we in the world face. So at any rate, idealists, right? They contend that America is a country of ideals. And we talked about those with Bernard Bailyn's thesis on the War for Independence. He thinks it was more than a war for independence, right? He thinks it was a bona fide revolution. Notions of equality of all people, sovereignty or permission to rule comes from the consent or permission of the governed. We're entitled to natural rights on behalf of our humanity, and it's the government's job to be our servant, not our master, and provide those rights and opportunities to us. In line with Adam Smith's book on capitalism, that all people have the God-given, ought to have the God-given ability of self-cultivation or pursuit of happiness, to be able to go into schools, training, apprentice yourself under someone, learn whatever skills you can, right? Attain whatever education you can, and let the sky be the limit as far as how far your talent and hard work and good luck will take you. So that type of idealism is tied to this interpretation, right? Is that the Civil War was, according to this old school court history account, is it was a crusade, right? It was a righteous, idealistic crusade to end slavery, to finally fulfill what the founding fathers had flirted with, right, in their rhetoric during the War for Independence. Okay. Now, how was that attained? Court history narrative, I need you to know a little more, okay? As far as how they, the nuts and bolts, if you will, right, of things changing. Now I want to get into a little bit of that. I began just a handout here. So first of all, right, I don't want to spend too much time on this. This is an introductory U.S. course, okay? But these are a few things that are oftentimes mentioned. Is one, there were population increase and dispersals, right? And dispersal. So people went. So supposedly it was simultaneous, you guys. You had urbanization, so that cities like Philadelphia, Boston, and New York just blew up, just mushroomed. You had new cities grow up on the frontier, like Chicago, Cincinnati, Detroit. But you also had people moving in large numbers simultaneously from the cities out into non-urban areas. And they, I don't know, it seems a little arbitrary, but they throw up the number 2,500 that to oftentimes to decide as their criterion for deciding if something is an urban area, right? If you have a population density of at least 2,500. So a lot of people also moved out of the cities and moved into frontier regions, right? On farms and on farmland and in the Appalachians and other mountain ranges. So people were moving all over the place, right? And so with that, right, you have contests for land and Western political participation, right? As you saw during the colonial period as well, new people moving into these new Western areas. Remember, because we bought the Louisiana Territory and it was all considered a territory until each state were carved up methodically. And now the Mexican-American War, the end of 1848, we have several states in the far west as well that are waiting to become annexed as states. So there's some ambiguity. There's some limbo land there, right? So you have contests for land. Newcomers are insisting on political participation, right? So that's one instance of kind of drama ensuing, right? You also have um, publicized urban issues, right? And so urban issues, for instance, growing crime. What about sewage, right? And other practical matters, street cleaning and lighting. You have immigration drama, especially with the Irish that were coming in such large numbers in the 1840s and 50s, right? So then that is going to lead to benevolent societies, as they called themselves. And literally thousands of them developed in the antebellum before the Civil War period. We're namely talking about the 1830s through 1850s. So benevolent societies, they tried to fight prostitution and alcoholism and crime. They tried to clean up the streets, right, and have housing improvement. They fought for labor issues, etc. And they also oftentimes fought to either condescendingly assimilate the Irish and German and other immigrants that were coming into the cities and try to, quote, Americanize them, or they kind of xenophobically tried to push them out and afraid that whatever you might define as American, that which was, quote, American, I'm saying that with quotes with my fingers, is become endangered, right, by these Catholic and other European immigrants. So you had those factors that supposedly led to like reform and changes. You, of course, had economic developments. So what I'm going over right now, you guys, is almost universally applied as context, as surrounding information, right, that gives you a sense of backdrop and background to this antebellum generation. So economic developments, you have the beginnings of, what would you, I mean, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, okay? But the very rudimentary beginnings of mass production. Because remember, you're not going to get interchangeable parts yet. You're not going to get the conveyor belts and the assembly line as far as it goes with Frederick Winslow Taylor and Henry Ford. None of that, that's almost 100 years away, okay? Or at least a half century away. But what I mean by that is that now you're going to get steam-powered machines make products versus handmade by skilled workers, by artisans. So artisans are going to be able to foresee and resent and fight against their sense of obsolescence, right? That they're going to become obsolete. That's why it's very awesome and admirable, but it's a little bit kind of quaint. You know, you consider it almost condescendingly when you see shows on, you know, a mom and pop or a father and son who create like awesome custom motorcycles, but they're literally making like one at a time, and they're selling it for great money, obviously, and to celebrities, etc. But the point being, right, that that's kind of a bygone of way of producing. That mass production has taken over, and that you can't compete with them because they can make things in such high quantities and at such a low price. Ryan Clatton.
Yeah. Can you hear me right now?
I can.
Okay. So the homework that you've given us is different than what you're showing on screen.
Okay. Now remember, Ryan, okay, is what I want to do is there's a method to my madness, if you will, is if all I did was what I'm doing right now, just giving you kind of narrative of changes. This happened in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, and this also happened, and this also happened, and here was this group, and here was that group. I could not be more adamantly against that pedagogy, that style of teaching. Okay. To me, the guts, the usefulness, right? The relevance, the depth of history comes in exercises like what I try to do, in making something argumentative and make you think about something that's relevant to today, that has, remnants as far as some of the parts of the discussion that are a part of our discourse today, right? To make it relevant, to make you critically think. Because after all, I mean, what use for your life is knowing about the beginnings of mass production in the 1820s? I get that, I really do. But the point being is I have to assume with some at a junior college, particularly, right, with general acceptance of all, that some may have a very weak background in history. They could be intelligent as can be, but just have not yet been introduced, right, to the discipline of US history. And so they're only going to know theoretically what I have in the argumentative paper. And I only put in the argumentative paper that which is, arguably convenient to defend my argument, right? And I leave out other stuff. So when you're, writing a book as an historian, or if you're even just teaching as a teacher, you don't want to take things out of context. You always want to have discourse. You want to have relevance to today, right? You want to make your students critically think. But the idea is you first have to have a foundation, right? You first have to have that foundation of factual knowledge to work with. So then, right, when you say, I think the Civil War was really about such and such, and the reason is, and then you go to the section that I'm working on right now, and you find hard data to support your claim. You know what I'm saying? So trust me, I could not be more against only doing this type of pedagogy. I just won't. I refuse to. I think it's useless. It doesn't require higher levels of critical thinking, but I consider it a lesser evil. Not a lesser evil, I'm sorry, a necessary evil. That just as a foundation, that once you become familiar with some of the basic facts that are mentioned, then you could use that, right? You could use those facts to support and challenge different arguments. Was I okay as far as my clarity on that?
Yeah, thank you.
No problem. Okay. So I'll try. Okay. I'll try not to get caught up too much in this. Okay. I promise. But like I said, I just wanted to at least give you some of the beginnings of this stuff. So you have the beginnings of mass production. So artisans in particular are going to be hit hard by this, right? You also have a move into the deep South, right? From Virginia, North Carolina, and Maryland. Remember at the end of the War of 1812, the Seminole Wars, etc., they created, as they did also in the Ohio Valley, kind of a land rush, if you will. Available lands opened up, taken from the Red Sticks, taken from the Trail of Tear tribes, right? Now opened up. So there was a large demographic movement down into, right? So for instance, into southern Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia in particular. And they contend, right, that it was kind of a marriage made in hell. The soil in Georgia at certain belts around certain river ranges is just superb, right? Then also they face, despite the closing of the international slave trade, right? Despite the closing of that, you had a natural increase, right? During the antebellum period. So they experienced a somewhat glut in slaves as far as their market price declined. Remember, you also have Wildcat Bank credit accessibility. So now So you got lands opening up cheaply, in some cases even for free. Then you have credit increasingly available to you. The price of slaves increasingly becoming more affordable, right? Then you also have the rise in textile industries demand for cotton, coupled with Eli Whitney's cotton gin that made separating the sticky seeds of short strain cotton from the stems more easily, cheaply, and efficiently done. So all of that last sentence, right, supposedly gave an incentive to become a parvenu, slave owning, cash crop producing planter. And they were known because they fought so tenaciously in the legislators at the state and national level to keep their rights to their slaves as drama ensued, that they were called fire eaters. The notion was, right? Remember, parvenu was like the Beverly Hillbillies, like nouveau riche, someone who had once, been brought up in very humble, poor circumstances, and suddenly, luckily, comes into great wealth and is newly rich. Then also the West became very important. So for one, you had Wilmot's Proviso in 1847. David Wilmot of Pennsylvania brought forth a request for them to vote in Congress on prohibiting slavery anywhere in far western land taken from Mexico. Remember, we're talking about California, Nevada, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico. That's a lot of land, right? And so he says, I move that we prohibit slavery to even have a chance to go there whatsoever, right? And it literally started fights in Congress. It was such a heated, disputed topic and proposition. And as you could easily guess, it didn't pass. All right. So what I'm saying is, right, is the points that I'm putting in served as arguably like either emblematic of drama that was connected to the West, or actually like sparks, that events that happened in the West that helped spark the Civil War. All right. Then you have Missouri Compromise, right, of 1820, gave the 36-30 latitude line, saying in the future, as these territories become states, north of that shall be free labor, and south of that has the option to have slavery, right? But then you had the Compromise of 1850, and that made California, right, which stretched across that line, free. Now there's one more free state, California, than there are slave states represented in Congress. But in return, right, they promised a fugitive slave law so that all states were federally mandated to hand over runaway slaves from any state. And you could look up an episode in Syracuse, New York, when a Black alleged runaway slave was at a Black church in Syracuse, New York. The church was surrounded. The slave posse had come all the way from a southern state, and the church members refused to hand him over, and violence ensued. I think at least 3 states declared that they were not going to enforce the fugitive slave law. They called them liberty laws, that they refused to hand over runaway slaves or even alleged runaway slaves. All right. And then even more dramatic, arguably, was to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And that, right, was to decide by popular decision. In this case, it was by a referendum. You could do, representative democracy and have your elected reps vote on it in the legislature. Or in their case, they did a direct popular vote, a referendum, for let the people in Kansas, right, decide for themselves if they want slavery or not. And as you may know, that culminated in both sides contending that they won, that the other side cheated, refusing to step down, and it literally created a civil war known as the Bleeding Kansas episode. Very dramatic. So notice how much of this is going on in the 1850s. Lots of polarizing events, right? And remember, by polarizing, I mean like with magnetism, that it almost naturally forces a dichotomy in pushing people into one side or the completely opposing side. All right. I'm sure there's more, but we'll move on. All right. So these are some of that which is considered context as to what is going on while these reform movements are going on, while the abolitionist crusade is going on, right? They're experiencing all this stuff that and much more, obviously, that I've just stated, okay? So I promise I'll be more brief here, but I really want to encourage you, if you have the time, the extra time to look into some of these topics, they're fascinating. Okay, so like I said, urban benevolent societies. And like I said, that went everything from police enforcement, anti-saloons and prostitution, clean up the streets, deal with sewage, et cetera, et cetera. You also had health reform. A guy named Sylvester Graham that the Graham Crackers named after. He's an interesting fellow. Then you have prison and asylum, because that's what they called it back then, right? For the psychologically, those with psychological ailments. Prison and asylum reform. I would look up Dorothy Dix. Very interesting topic. Of course, you had the temperance movement against alcohol. You had the women's rights movement. Look up Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. The Declaration of Sentiments, where the women, right, under Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, quoted the Declaration of Independence and demanding their natural rights and political equality, right? You have educational reform. You have religious reform. You have the Second Great Awakening. You have the splitting of churches, denominations over the slavery issue, like the Presbyterians, Methodists, and Baptists. Okay, educational reform, I would look up a guy named Horace Mann, M-A-N-N. Very interesting topic with public school system reform. Religious form, I would look up a guy named Finney, F-I-N-N-E-Y. A very interesting evangelical, preacher for revivals. And he shook a lot of feathers. You had the Transcendentalists. I remember the Transcendentalists were kind of like, I call them like intellectual hippies. They embraced part of the Romantic movement that was going on with Coleridge and Lord Byron and others back in Chateaubriand back in Europe. And they contended, right, that in a way they were against the Enlightenment and saying that the way to knowledge, right, epistemology, the way that you get to know what you know and accept as knowledge ought to include especially your guts, your intuition, your emotion. And they got very mystical about it. They wanted you to transcend um, your animal existence in settled society, right? Like Henry David Thoreau going out into the wilderness at Walden Pond, right, in New England. And so the idea of get away from the hustle and bustle. Remember, he's the one that wrote that the average American was living a desperately, just a life of quiet desperation and conformity and blind robotic conformity to his leaders, his institutions, and his peers. The Transcendentalists wanted you to break free and liberate yourself from all of that. They wanted you to go and commune with nature and engage in physical work, engage in psychological and philosophical introspection, read books, right? And try to learn and get to knowledge and meaning, whatever might be meaning in your life. And that way they predated like the beatniks with existentialism, right? That your meaning of life may not be mine, but find your own meaning of life, right? But the journey there was what was so big to them as far as it being pertinent to the abolitionist cause, as they felt it was imperative that all human beings ought to be free from all coercion. Any institution that tries to force conformity to a certain pattern of behavior or values, that you were to find your own way, right? So some of them technically, at least on paper, were for anarchy, for no government at all. And that's where you get also the utopian communes. Look up Oneida, Brook Farm, New Harmony. Fascinating, fascinating subjects, right? There was a guy named Charles Fourier who was like an early pre-Marx socialist who wrote about scientific management of resources, all held cooperatively for the common good, right? Some of them followed Fourier's writings. Some of them were following a religious, almost kind of cult leader, like the Shakers at that time, following Mother Ann. But like I said, I can't say it enough, very fascinating. At times, they did away with private property. They did away with the nuclear family in some cases of mom, dad, and the kids. And they had, very unconventional things as far as, like at Oneida at times, is you had leaders making couples out of people. You had, quote, free love. You had some advocating celibacy. So they all varied, but notice just how I don't mean it in a negative way, but how radically some of their practices and so forth transcended what the institutions outside those communes were for and against. Very, very radically different. All right. And so, you have the Transcendentalists. You also have the Mormons, right, of Latter-day Saints. And so from the Epiphany, right, of Joseph Smith, to persecution, to grudging legal recognition, right, under Brigham Young. Fascinating, fascinating topic. So there were lots of movements going on, right, at this time during the antebellum period. And of course, right, the abolitionist cause, wanting to abolish slavery. So notice what we're doing here, right, is first and foremost, right, people will contend a couple things. Like one is that this clearly was a time of flux, of people questioning things, questioning their leaders, questioning the values and the practices that had been handed down to them by previous generations. And they clearly were willing to challenge those and to go in a new, refreshing, original direction with them, right? And so that this is tied to the Civil War, right? And that this, because remember, before this, you were a hero like Henry Clay, for instance, if you averted civil war. If the North and South, like with the Missouri Compromise, he was a hero of that, Henry Clay, with his decision to compromise on that. But now with this generation, right, you can make the argument amongst these reformers, you wouldn't be praised for that. They would contend that you're a coward and that you're trying to avoid, in your attempt to avoid conflict, you're failing to take on a major problem, a major sin, right, or moral evil in the form of slavery and other practices that they felt were wrong, for lack of a better adjective, in the antebellum period. So what about political radicalization? Is for one, right, political parties solely fixed on ending slavery. So you have the Liberty Party, you have the Free Soil Party, and you have ultimately in the early 1850s, the Republican Party. I'm going to put a question when I put solely fixed. Maybe that's too strong of a statement, because when you look at those parties, they weren't strictly just abolitionists. And remember, an abolitionist had the courage to say that slavery was a moral issue and that it was unethical, and said that it needed to be and could be eradicated in all states and territories by a measure taken by Congress and or the president. Right? Then you had a guy named Birney and the inevitable demise of slavery as intended by the founding fathers. That last part, right, is what was so considered to be so radical. Is they contending, hey, the founding fathers, who we all collectively admire, we believe, right, as the beginnings of conscious Whigs, as they were called, and then later Republicans, that the founding fathers would want us to do away with it. Okay. Okay, no problem. I want to make sure if there's something I need to answer. All right. So let's see here. In addition to that, right? Territory loophole, right? And one who was famous for this was Abraham Lincoln. Is that the Articles of Confederation had outlawed slavery in the Ohio Valley Territory before statehood. So why couldn't they do the same in the far West? That Congress should therefore have the power to do away with slavery in the West before they become states. Because remember, the notion is that we have a federal republic, a balance, right? A tension between state power and federal or central power. And nowhere in Articles 1 or 2 or 3 does it give that power to any of the three branches to end slavery in a state where it's already been sanctioned, like Alabama, etc. So the notion was, including held by Lincoln, who was, by the way, seen by his contemporaries and subsequent historians as a moderate and not a radical abolitionist, contended, therefore, he could not legally, at least up to a point, as you'll see, could not touch slavery in states where it already existed. But then you have some Garrisonians under William Lloyd Garrison. And they, right, stated that natural laws some of them being religious or the Bible, trump our man-made Constitution. And so hence, we can prohibit slavery anywhere, regardless of the Constitution's ambiguity. So think about some of these things that I'm mentioning, okay, on section 3. Think about how, to the degree that this is scaring the South. It's like the Northerners, the Yankees, are getting more and more militant. Because after all, right, generation after generation got by treating it as the elephant in the room, right? You disagree with your father-in-law on religion or politics, it becomes the elephant in the room that you just don't mention. You just don't touch that topic, right? Same thing with slavery. I mean, for a while, we literally had, and the Southerners tried to extend it, we had a gag rule where that you could not even take the floor in Congress and mention slavery, much less try to make a motion that there be a vote to end it. All right. Then you had a campaign against the Southern planters. So fascinating people here, right? Look up Salmon Chase. And look up also, give me just a moment, James Burney, as I mentioned already, and especially Joshua Giddings. They gave famous speeches. They wrote works. They even traveled into the South, not all of them, to enlist the party conversion of Southern white men. And as you could easily guess, they tried to make the argument that slavery was hurting Southern white men almost as badly as it was hurting the slaves. That it was providing them of jobs that could have been offered to them. Not just jobs, right? But they knew they would not be enslaved and worked without compensation, right? So they knew that they would have a chance as sharecroppers, etc., to earn money, to purchase a portion of the land that they were farming from their farming boss, and hence would have opportunities to rise if only they'd stop giving those jobs to the slaves, right? And that the wealth of slave cotton production in particular was enriching our Belgian and English rivals in textile manufacturing. And they were doing so well that they were refusing to enlist in transportation, communication, and diversification into new industries. Kind of like the opposite of what the opposite end of them saying necessity is the mother of invention, right? If you get to a point where you absolutely need to invent something or do something to survive, you're largely going to do it. Likewise, the other end, right, deals with complacency, that the Southern planters were becoming complacent. Life was good. The common boast was cotton is king in the 1850s. So why should they want to engage in infrastructure and diversify with different industries, etc.? And that was hurting, in particular, the white Southern men. So now the new Republican Party is trying to win over, right, the Southern white population and trying to vilify the Southern white leaders in their eyes. So they tried to prohibit slavery in the far west territory before statehood materialized, right? So for instance, Lincoln was actually in that category, right? So remember, think of this though, is think of representation. You get 2 reps, you get 2 senators no matter what. You get 1 House rep for every 30,000 civilians. Now they're going to represent newly annexed New Mexico, Nevada, etc., right? The idea is it's factionalism, written by Madison long ago, that people, including Americans, are inherently selfish and they're primarily led by self-interest. And so hence, people who share the same career, right, are going to inadvertently develop the same self-interest. What's good for one cash crop slave owning farmer in New Mexico is going to be good for another cash crop slave owning planter in Georgia. And so the idea is who is going to win allies in Congress from the West. And the idea was if they allowed slavery in that state, they would become Southern allies. If they prohibited slavery in that area, they could likely become Northern allies, right? And whoever has a majority in both houses literally gets to write the laws of the nation, literally runs the show. So notice some of this was about power and economic influence. And then lastly, the radicals increasingly refused to endorse pork barrel legislation without others uncompromising opposition to slavery. So now, right, the Southerners are feeling like these radical Republicans are beginning to twist the arm of other people in Congress and become very forceful, coercive, manipulative. Remember, pork barrel legislation is, we'll throw in, okay, what do you want, rep? What does your constituency want that you're representing? Oh, they want a new bridge. They want this or that. Okay, fine. You say yes to this legislation, and I'll be okay with you throwing that into the law at the bottom, right? So that was common. It's been common in American political tradition. The radicals began to say, no, we won't cooperate with you if you don't cooperate with us. You have to take a stronger stand or you lose our vote in Congress. So again, some of these names, if you wanted to look up: Salmon Chase, Joshua Giddings, George Julian, Charles Sumner, etc. You get the point. So now, what were the effects of all this? Okay. The effects were, for one, they forced the nation to confront the issue of slavery in public discourse and public dialogue. They forced the issue. Okay. Also, they disseminated assumptions that were allegedly embraced by many who had not participated in their antebellum movements. So hence, these common assumptions went beyond their small circle of reformers. One, skepticism or even defiance of tradition and of institutions and of societal leaders. So I think in particular on this one, right, I think of the transcendentalists like Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson. They encourage their generation to be skeptical about traditions. Remember, institutions are any formal body of men that has an assigned role, formal or informal, in the functioning of society. So governments at all levels, right? Churches, families, those would all be examples of institutions. Another one, a humanistic optimism, kind of going back to the Renaissance, right? Of man's potential. A lot of those reforms were aimed at either or both, reforming the individual or reforming the community, or like I said, both. So there was a lot of optimism. With the benevolent societies, that civic virtue ought to be expected of all citizens. And remember, civic virtue, like Cicero and Tacitus back at Rome, it's putting the needs of the community above your own. It's filling a nobleman's obligation, noblesse oblige, to those less fortunate who can't defend themselves. So these assumptions arguably permeated that entire generation and may have led to the Civil War. All right. So with number one, you see evidence of court history. I try to praise the reformers and show how idealistic they were, how badly they wanted to change the world for the better, solve all problems, get involved in other people's problems in business and fix them, right? So this was clearly depicted as a generation that's not okay with simply allowing something like slavery to go unchallenged. And notice also with the abolitionists as a part of this antebellum reform-minded idealistic generation, they not only were a numerical minority, but yet, despite that, the idea was their influence became disproportionately much larger than their numbers might seem to suggest because of the cylindrical rotary press, right? The penny press, steam-powered engines that powered the production of newspapers that would become very cheap. A growing public school system throughout the states that created a more literate population to be able to buy and read, right, those newspapers. Then you also have the lyceums. And the lyceums were intellectual fairs that any person could come, pay a couple pennies, and listen to a myriad of experts from different universities, etc., expound upon a given topic. And of course, the topics were variegated. You'd have people talk about insects, an expert on such, and then that person would be followed by an abolitionist who would tell you why you ought to fight against slavery. And then, of course, some abolitionists became famous, like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, right? Harriet Tubman, mainly because, boy, they had the credentials of credibility. They were Black. They had been slaves. They lived it. They knew exactly what it was like and how awful it was. And they let the northern crowds at these lyceums and through the printed newspapers, they let them know and moved them emotionally. Arthur and Lewis Tappan were wealthy businessmen up in the North, and they spent a lot of their fortune into creating kind of an abolitionist army. They flooded literature into the South. And of course, the Southern reps in Congress tried to have it stopped. They formed missionaries to go down into the South and other areas to make converts, not to evangelical Christianity, although many of them were, but to the abolitionist cause. They established the printed word, etc., and its dissemination or spreading. Note the Republican Party, they were against the spreading of slavery to the West, but they conceded that they didn't feel it was constitutionally acceptable to end slavery in the states where it already existed. So to many abolitionists, the mainstream, middle of the road Republicans were way too lukewarm for their taste. And for a while, that included Abraham Lincoln. All right. Then I try to show how they became more radical, more pushy, more confrontational, and to the South, more insightfully scary. Notice the sentence here. They picked a fight that needed to be fought. Look at the way even the moderate Lincoln could get under the skin of the Southern planters. If A can prove, however conclusively, that he may have right enslaved B, why may not B snatch the same argument? Even prove equally that he may enslave A. Oh, because you say why A is white and B is black. So it's color then. The lighter having the right to enslave the darker. Take care, by this rule, you are to become the slave of the first man you meet with fairer skin than your own. Oh, you don't mean color exactly. You're referring to the Sambo image, right? That whites are intellectually superior to blacks and therefore have the right to enslave them. Take care again, for by this rule, you are to become the slave of the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. Wow, huh? So he knew how to take the arguments of the Southern apologists like Calhoun and turn them on their head to show how they were logically unsustainable. So now I'm going to move on to number 2, okay? Number 1, court history. It was a crusade. It was largely brought about by a brave, courageous, anomalous, out of the ordinary generation of idealistic people who forced the issue, tried to improve the world for the better, successfully confronted the South on this issue, and used drama over issues of the West, right? Of Western territories being incorporated as new states as their springboard into having a final battle over this issue. Then revisionist to that thesis, you find in number 2. So it's pretty easy to anticipate that this is going to be much more cynical, much more negative, right? About that generation, about the Northern leaders who fought against the 11 states that tried to leave the country from 1861 to 1865 in the Civil War, known as the Confederacy. And what do you know? You have a lot of things that make that nice narrative of number 1 that muddy the waters, if you will. 19 northern states. How many gave some rights to some African-American men? 5. 5 out of 19? That's pretty weak. Some even instituted Jim Crow laws during the war. So much for fighting as a crusade to help African Americans, right? The bona fide abolitionist who didn't care about the Constitution and wanted slavery ended everywhere by Congress or the president, even in the states. They constituted, historians think, about 2.5% of the population. That's it. A lot of them attacked and even killed right? By xenophobic, racist white mobs. Elijah Lovejoy, William Lloyd Garrison, almost murdered. He was left hanging and the police saved him before he asphyxiated. They were killed, you guys, or attacked by white Yankee crowds. Look up the draft riot that you find like in the Gangs of New York movie, right? Primarily on their platform, if you will, they were fighting, saying they don't want the coercive power of Congress to make them go to war, right? They also said that they thought the war was for rich businessmen that were running Congress and were opposed to slavery for the wrong reasons, because they wanted to employ people in their factories instead. Because by the way, you look up the Free Soilers, there were a lot of people who wanted, quote, free labor and free soil for reasons much different than humanitarianism or egalitarianism of everyone being equal. They wanted to offer that to their voters, right? Labor, jobs, opportunities to rise up to white laborers, not black men. They wanted factional allies who were in the same type of businesses as they, so they would likely vote along with them, the same side on the same issues, right? Some of them just felt like slavery was archaic, right? Like from an old Stone Age, and that it didn't work well. One obvious reason is you have no incentive for the African slaves. They're not being paid. There's no promotion. So what incentive do they have to work hard? So those and other reasons, right, were oftentimes espoused by Republicans, not humanitarian concern for black men and women. Then during the war, Congress passed at least 3 confiscation acts, and they used the hated Dred Scott case of treating slaves as agricultural property, as chattel, and contended that they refused to see the Confederacy as a separate belligerent nation, but that they were traitorous rebels rebelling against their own country. So therefore, guilty of the act of treason, the government had a right to confiscate their property once they caught them as a prisoner of war after a battle, and could confiscate their, quote, chattel property. You look at Benjamin Butler and other Northern Yankee leaders of the Army of the Potomac, which was a Yankee army, right? The Northern Army against the South. And they treated the runaway slaves like garbage. They made them do all the hated work, digging the latrines, burying the dead. And for the longest time, they did not trust putting a gun in their hands and wouldn't use them as soldiers. There's a quote from George Julian, a senator who was an abolitionist. And he basically tells us, in disgust, he tells his Northern compatriots in Congress, well, I tried to appeal to your humanitarianism by freeing the slaves everywhere and giving them the chance to prove themselves in battle as soldiers. And it didn't work. He says, so now I'm going to appeal to your self-interest. Using black slaves can divide and conquer the South. It'll psychologically frighten them. It'll encourage their slaves in the South to rebel and run away to the Northern Army. It will be a practical use for us. After all, right, for most of the beginning 2 years of this war, the North lost most of the major battles. So we need their help, he said also, right? So was it more out of desperation? Was it as a desire to weaken and divide and conquer the South? Their subsequent decision, the president and Congress, to free the slaves. And then you look at Lincoln. He was a wily guy, man. You could claim that there was an evolution in court history, right? According to his own claim, he was indifferent to slavery as a kid. 1838 and 1841, he went on riverboat, trips, not recreational, but as his job. He was a middleman and taking someone's produce to a market. Both occasions he saw slaves for the first time, chained up, whipped, and supposedly it had a moving effect on him. After that, when he got into politics, he gradually began to try to publicly defend the rights of abolitionists to speak their mind, who were being attacked in the North, right? Then, as a beginning congressman, he began to take become convinced of Bernie and other guys' conviction that the founding fathers intended slavery to eventually slowly die out. And that the key to allowing it to die out is to not allow it to spread any further to the West. And he took that stance publicly in the Lincoln Douglas debates with Stephen Douglas, not the Black Frederick Douglass. Stephen Douglas was the one who said, let the states like Kansas decide for themselves if they want slavery, right? Lincoln said, no, if it's in the West and it's not a state yet, the federal government ought to prohibit it everywhere. And being a wise, shrewd politician, Stephen Douglas, in front of a big crowd, said, you're telling me that if all the voters and people of Kentucky or Kansas and Nebraska want slavery, you and Congress would unilaterally on your own overturn their decision and their desire and say no? And Lincoln took the stand and says, yes, I would. Said because slavery is immoral. That made him sound more like an abolitionist now, right? Having the courage to take it on as a moral issue. And that we don't have a democracy, we have a republic. Not all decisions, especially decisions of slavery, should be put in the hands of the common people by way of a referendum or popular vote, he said. And he became known after that as the tyrant down in the South, right? That's what John Wilkes Booth referred to with his Latin phrase after he shot him. Then from there, right, during the war, Lincoln jokingly said, I would love God's help in this war, but I need Kentucky. He was a real witty, silly guy. But it was the truth behind it was there is that he really felt compelled that the sides were so evenly matched that the states in the middle of North and South, what side they chose could dictate who won. So he gave an offer to Tennessee, Kentucky, and Missouri. He said, if you guys fight with me in the country and stay loyal, you can keep your slaves. Wow, right? So then when he issued his Emancipation Proclamation, did that declare all slaves free by executive decree? No. He said only the slaves of rebels who refused to put their arms down against the United States Army, only their slaves are to be declared free. So in a sense, that's not much different, if at all, from the confiscation acts that had already been made. In his defense, however, it's known as the chess analogy. William Seward, a radical abolitionist that he had put on his cabinet, threatened to quit at one time and said, man, you keep teasing us as abolitionists. You seem like you're gravitating toward our camp, and then you pull something like this with your deal with Kentucky. And he pulls him aside and says, hey, look at the people who ran overtly as abolitionists for president, right? John C. Fremont, him, William Seward, they lost badly. They didn't hardly win a single northern state, much less the South. So he said, I have to appear to be more moderate than I really am in order to win the presidency and win my reelection, even during the war in '64. And he said, once I get in a powerful position where I can dictate it and I no longer need the border states' help, he said, I'm going to eventually end slavery everywhere, universally. They just don't know it yet. That's known as his chess analogy. And in, I guess, slight defense of him and that contention, he ended up giving 3 letters to the Kentucky legislator. And the third letter is pretty interesting, where he says, twice I've tried to give you a separate deal from everyone else. I wanted to reward your loyalty to us and your help in the war by granting you and you alone a gradual compensated emancipation program, whereby all slaves 30 years old or older are to remain slaves for the rest of their life. But all slaves under 30 are to be purchased by the government. You'll be compensated for their price, and we're going to buy their freedom from you, right? Kentucky said, no, And he said, sorry, I'm going to have to treat you as no different from anybody else now. And then shortly thereafter came the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery universally, everywhere, even in the States, that where it was already established. So revisionist history says, come on, guys, this was about power. The North was almost as racist as the South. Their motives were impure. When they finally freed the slaves and used them as soldiers, it was for their own benefit, to help out the war effort, etc. And so, yeah. Any comments or questions on number 1 or 2? And do you guys have any reasons for which you find this interesting? What do you find interesting or not about this topic? I think I'm a history nerd, but I think this one's fascinating. All right, you quiet bunch. Let me look. Okay, make sure I have your names. All right. Okay, so I'm done. Have your names. You'll get your well-earned extra credit. Okay, guys, if you guys don't have any other questions, that's it for me. I hope that I gave you context to the coming of the Civil War, gave you a couple different interpretations and the reasons for which different historians adhere to those different interpretations, so as to kind of better equip you. You already do these very well, and I mean that, but to do a good job on this one, to also do well relatively on test 3, but also if for the few of you that are moving on in U.S. history or history in general as a major, I like to think I'm giving you a little bit of a step up in preparation for your upper division classes or graduate classes, where you deal with the strengths and weaknesses of different theses or arguments or interpretations to the same events. All right, you quiet bunch. I'm going to go ahead and let you go then, okay? I have your names. You'll get your well-earned extra credit. I appreciate you being here. And you guys have a good week, okay?